Cybersecurity isn't an exact science. It's the confluence of art and science, where scientific components must be artfully applied and reapplied to make sure security strategies are combat ready in a world where attackers always get the first move. In this podcast, we focus on the art of security, applying our experiences as security professionals and researchers to hash out practical takeaways on confronting questions that organizations, practitioners, and sometimes individuals can use to keep them a little bit more secure. My name is Josh Davies, and I'm joined by my co-host Tyler Reguly. And today's topic is a bit of a mind-boggler, or who watches the watchers, or in my best Latin, quis custodiet ipsos custodes. I did study Latin briefly, Tyler, but I absolutely failed it at university when I was trying to better understand the ancient Roman cultures. But hey, Tyler, how are you doing? What have you been up to recently?
Absolutely nothing. Trolling Reddit, looking for interesting things to talk about, and reading posts on LinkedIn, and that's about it. That's the only exciting thing in my life. How about you?
I mean, yeah, big old research holes the last few weeks, but enjoying working with some of our researchers to kind of push out copies on threat actor write-ups has probably been the highlight of the work I've got to focus on this week. But yeah, back to the question. Who watches the watchers, or who watches the watchman, as the traditional phrase goes? I thought I'd start with this. Was there a point in your career where you asked yourself, who's watching me? Or maybe where you realized, I kind of have a high level of access or responsibility here. Could I use this for bad?
So I'll start with a story. Maybe a story I shouldn't tell, but a story I will tell. So when I, first entered the industry, I was working at the college that I was attending. And I had the opportunity to work or apply for positions in a couple of different departments. And one of the departments I applied to, was the networking department, with an interest in working in security. And, when they asked why I had applied, I said, because I couldn't help but notice, that you have Cisco routers without authentication on them that can be accessed by anybody and used to tunnel connections. And they said, well, how did you discover this? And I said, because I was curious about the security of the network that I was going to school on. And I wanted to see what level of security was there. And they're like, so you probed our networks without our permission? I said, I guess I did. From then on, I was delegated to working in the student support center and not network services. And they kept a very close eye on me the entire time I was there. So I have experience of being the watched. So I guess that was the first time that it really became apparent to me at 19, 20 years old, that it was something you needed to pay attention to. Now, I still wish they had properly secured their networks, and I think that's a larger conversation. But definitely after that, anytime I met another person from IT, it was always, so you're the hacker we've heard about. And it kind of gave me a bit of a reputation in the environment.
Okay, nice. Well, you kind of outed yourself quite early there. I wonder if you'd have gone down a different path. Because that's kind of what I want to hit on, that these are some of the exact same skills, whether you're on the defense or the offense side. Knowledge of both benefits each other. And so we do have the capacity for evil as much as we have the capacity for good. And I think for me, I wasn't quite the same moment as that. I didn't do any offensive pieces myself, but it was actually my early SOC roles, stumbling across some information. It was actually IP to do with a kind of famous, it was an animated TV series that I really liked, and I could see they were working on the next season of it just by the titles of certain things that were in the logs. This company I was protecting, or as part of a managed service, and I thought, oh, maybe I could tell someone about this, or maybe I should tell my friends. And I thought, no, you're not supposed to have known this, we've seen this. So for me, it was that was an odd moment, because that's when I realized, I have an higher level of access here and power, before I then went to realize, that same sentiment also comes in place when it's about giving information that's not to do with a new TV series, but maybe to do with vulnerabilities or weak spots or blind spots in a network, because you do have that high level of access, and you can tell the customer, the organization about it to go fix it, or you could maybe go and tell someone else to monetize it, depending on which way you're aligned. So I think that sets that. I think that morality question comes in everyone's mind at some point in security, and then you kind of pick a side. And we might look at some people who picked a different side than you and I did. But today, I think we're going to break it down by looking at this huge topic in 3 sections. So first of all, I want to look at security vendors. Then I want to look at internal security teams. And then I want to look at external security teams or kind of managed service providers for you. So Tyler, security vendors. We can go from vulnerabilities in the software that is meant to defend you. You know, what's your kind of take as a vulnerability specialist on the state of that? Particularly in 2025, we saw a lot in SIEM, WAF, firewall, VPN, beyond.
So, I mean, it's one of those things that I think less about the how do I want to put this? I think less about the vulnerability stack that may exist within the products when I think about watching your external vendors, and more about the level of access you're giving that software. So I think, to your point on vulnerabilities, yes. And, we have things coming into place, right? Things like SBOMs that are supposed to help with validating the use of vulnerable libraries, for example, within these products, and things like that give a little bit more insight into what your vendors are doing and how they're doing it. But one of the questions you always have to ask is, what permissions does the tool set require to access my hosts? What permissions do I install the software with on the host? These are the things that you really have to wonder. Is your vendor asking for too much access or just the right amount of access? And I think that's a really big one for watching those tools, because if there is a vulnerability and the tool ends up being compromised, what assurances do you have? What safeguards do you have in place that will limit the abuse of that tool because of the access that it has into your environment?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's the only real way to go, because these vulnerabilities are inevitable. Even as hard as we try, and it's a whole nother conversation if we want to talk about whether this secure by design pledge is being followed as well as it could. But I think we have to accept vulnerabilities are going to happen, even if it feels weird when, to use an analogy, your bodyguard has a weak point that someone can just jab and this strode right into your house. So, the mitigation steps are important. So you kind of talk vulnerabilities. It seems like you're tabling those and you're focusing a little bit more on that kind of supply chain compromise angle and the permissions that they have. So where do you draw the line there? Because things like kernel level access is required for a lot of monitoring tools on an endpoint, say. So how do you go about doing that effectively when this really is, let's call it a bit of a luxury for maybe more mature security organizations to really scrutinize the supply chain that they have and not just inherently trust it?
So I think trust is an important word there. And I think it's about developing vendor customer trust. And we can think about this, I like analogies. I like taking things outside of the security world and to things that are more relatable to everybody. Because I often find myself trying to explain these concepts to people who don't necessarily understand all of the nitty-gritty behind them. And I think, you can think about this as a user looking at what service providers you're going to use. And it could be anything from the types of social media you're willing to give your information to the types of food delivery services or streaming services that you're willing to give your credit card information to. There is a certain level of trust. I know people who won't give their information to Meta. They will not have any Meta accounts because they don't trust Meta. There are people who won't give their information to TikTok because they don't trust TikTok. And the same thing has to happen in the enterprise. You have to sit down and say, is this a company I can trust? What is their track record? And you have to look at it historically and say, how do they deal with various problems when they arise? Because we all know it's not a matter of, if you'll be breached. It's a matter of when you'll be breached. And how you react and how you respond to that is very character defining. And so I think we really need to look at the character of vendors a lot more to see if they have, the same morals that we have as an enterprise using their products.
No, I like that, and I don't want to preempt some of our discussion later. So I think we'll come back when we look at external security teams as to some ways that you can maybe evaluate how trustworthy a vendor is that you might want to partner with going down that route. But we'll move on now to the internal security teams. And this is kind of, I think, where we started from in our stories, that we were working for. Well, actually, I was at an external team, but looking when you are a practitioner, when you kind of have that moment where you realize the superhero quotes are coming. I knew they would today. With great power comes great responsibility. So how do you, let's look at some risks of that first of all. Like what kind of risks are present with security professionals, whether that's SOC analysts or engineers, architects and the like, and then we'll move on to maybe how we can mitigate those.
So it's an interesting one, right? Because it's excuse me, it's not one of those things that is limited to the cybersecurity realm, right? It's one of those things that exists everywhere. And most recently, the story that comes to mind for me when I think about, insider risk is really what we're talking about here in many ways, but people who have too much access specifically. And what comes to mind for me was there was a big story here in Canada around one of our banks and one of their employees accessing our prime minister's banking information. And that made the news globally. It was a huge deal. Everyone heard about it and was talking about it. And the question is there a way to tell if somebody is going to go down that path? And I think, one of the things that we've seen historically with security companies is they're really big on background checks, on credit checks to see if there's, the opportunity for financial motivation there. And I'm not sure if those are the best approaches to it. I don't think those are necessarily indicative of if there's a problem or not. Sure, if you can find something on a person that says, hey, they've done this before, that's definitely a red flag. But otherwise, I feel like we might be putting the risk in the wrong place, because it's way too easy for somebody to be, what they think is a whistleblower because they've seen something and they take that information and run with it, when really they're not. They're just leaking information they shouldn't share. And so how do we approach that? Really good HR policies and actually reacting when somebody crosses the line. I think that's really important, is making sure you're paying attention, making sure you're properly segmenting data where it makes sense, and not over privileging accounts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have mixed opinions on the zero trust framework, but you kind of can apply some trust but verify approaches to your personnel as well, whether they're security practitioners or not. I like you say about the background checks. I think there's a balance to be had there. Like there are some government environments that you need security clearance from, where you are literally going to get quizzed about your entire life. And I have friends who've gone down that route. And actually, it's interesting where they don't mind if you've done the bad stuff. Sometimes they just want to see if you'll admit to it, because if you won't, they think you're more likely to be blackmailed by that. I also know people in security teams for financial services and kind of cryptocurrency exchanges, which can be huge targets. And that, you mentioned the credit score thing and that kind of financial motivation. There's a lot more than I initially realized from the outside when I start talking to people about how many people get tempted to be bribed and then how many people actually take those bribes. I know stories where as simple as taking screenshots, actually they use their phone to take it of customer information for kind of cryptocurrency wallets and accounts, and then sent that to the attackers who promised them, I can't remember the exact sum, but it was a sliver compared to what they ran away with. And that person got absolutely nothing. They socially engineered and stole millions and millions in cryptocurrency, but they didn't pay up that person. And actually they got scapegoated in kind of lengthy prison sentence. So it's not even just monitoring the people internally. There's pressures, I think, are coming out from the outside in on these people to potentially be those insider threats. But that brings us to how do you monitor them? Is it a case of applying the same? Once a threat gets in, they look like any threat, regardless whether they're inside a threat, whether they've managed to get legitimate credentials, and kind of having those detections run on there. are there whistleblower channels that are of any value to be able to kind of go and tell on someone when you think they're being suspicious? And is that even a valuable thing? Because I think for me, culture is the main thing, and you've kind of got to trust people to a degree. And sometimes if it gets a bit Orwellian, you can almost push people to the other side of trust, in my opinion.
Well, that's a good point. I think that's true of all policies and procedures that companies implement, that you have to walk a fine line between alienating your users and securing the company, because end users are always a risk, and need to be properly defended against in a way, as bad as that sounds. But you can definitely go too far, and then that leads to people looking for ways to get around things, and that's never good.
Well, nice. Well, I think that's a few bits to take away from there. But for me, it does boil down to that culture that you can build internally. And I think one area that I've seen, I've never seen any insider threats in the SOC, so I hope, but I have seen people get disgruntled, and that can often be because of they're not being rewarded as employees like they should do. And I think that's how you build that culture. Yes, it's about fostering good environments and good practices and kind of open spaces, but also it's about rewarding your employees, because otherwise that financial motivation from the attackers can become more powerful, or worse. If they feel like they're slighted, they might feel justified to come and do some of this stuff, which I think will play into it.
I think you've touched on what is probably the biggest one, in my mind when I think about trust with employees, is that you end up with a disgruntled employee, because they're not, they look at another company and they're like, oh, that company, and let's just take the risk of taking trade secrets to another company, which is, I think, definitely one of the things you have to be aware of with IT people who have access to all of your shares and everything else. If you're not properly compensating them, and they see that another company, especially in this day and age, when we have more and more payroll visibility, much more payroll visibility in job postings, and you can say, hey, this company's hiring for my role, but they pay 3 times as much as I'm getting paid. Well, what if I go over there, but take source code with me? That's a risk that you run by not properly compensating employees. And I don't think that there's enough people out there, whether that is vendors and their employees leaving with Intel, whether that is internal employees to an enterprise, or those external SOC employees and whoever they're getting paid by. I think that's actually one that spans all 3 of the classes that we've talked about today.
I like it. So I think this one is going to be somewhat similar. I think some of the risks, but maybe it's a different way you can control it, because we look at maybe external security teams. They are very much have a similar level of access, sometimes less, but they do definitely have at least, let's say, the ability to read everything that's in your environment and information that they can maybe take home and swap their hats and then go the other way. And on the other side, we also have this kind of motivation that maybe the cynical side of me thinks, but what I have seen in reality in news articles is people creating their own business for themselves. Maybe a penetration tester kind of offering services to a place that he's already compromised. It's kind of reminiscent of your example at the top of this podcast, where you said you saw that they had really weak network devices. You didn't go quite as far, but there are news articles of people who've compromised them and then come in to kind of save the day, and has since had lengthy jail sentences as a result. So how would you categorize the differences in risk first between an internal and an external security team?
So this is an interesting one for me. And I don't know how to say this other than, to me, internal security is always far more valuable than external security. I realize that there is a cost-effective reason why a lot of companies go to that external SOC. I think that you need a lot more development of trust and a lot more. You have to put your faith in an external company a lot more than you do your internal employees, because you don't work with them at the same level every day. You don't see them. You are acting solely on contractual relationships. And for that reason, I think it's a harder thing to do based on trust alone. And it's one of those things that I don't think I have a good answer to, because I don't know if I would necessarily, if I looked at having my internal SOC versus an external SOC, I would personally prefer to have an internal SOC working with me. I realize it's not always feasible, especially for smaller companies. And so for them, they really have to do their research into, and much the same as you do in the vendor space, external SOCs are really vendors when you think about it. They're just, the product is people. You really have to look into how have they worked in the past? How have they dealt with incidents in the past? Have they ever had any issues that have blown up publicly? And can you trust in that, I think, is the only thing I would do.
And maybe to go to an example of something that did blow up publicly, because I think this is an interesting story and a great example of what can happen when you bring these external providers in. And I will say this is very much an edge case, maybe even a corner case. This happens a lot less, almost never really. You see it in comparison to the daily outcomes that an external team will provide for you, and there's the benefits massively outweigh the risk, in my opinion. But when it's bad, it's bad. And I recall the ALFPH ransomware group, or the Black Cat ecosystem, I think it was called. There were two, potentially three insider threats for an external security team. One of them was an incident responder, or digital forensics and IR, who was sent in to kind of help organizations. And then the other two were part of a ransomware negotiating company. They became affiliates of this ransomware as a service group from Black Hat and got a 70% to 80% of the ransom, which I think was about 1.2 million cryptocurrency, by deploying it on the systems they were kind of hired and parachuted in to come and protect. So, yeah. Maybe we don't hear about it so much because maybe most other people are much better at getting away from it, because you kind of come into an organization that's already compromised and you're there to clean it up. So who's to say that it was you that made it worse, or if it was just the natural propagation of persistent access the attacker may have had? Because we know that just because once you compromise, there's still a window between them getting to a point where they can kind of achieve their objectives from ransomware. So yeah, it can be bad. Those people were indeed caught. But yeah, the reality, I think, is that appetite that you have to have for what you're going to allow them to do. And I think sometimes, Tyler, you and I talk about professional paranoia, and I'm hesitant to try and give people too much paranoia from and just staying away entirely and trying to do it themselves. There's huge benefit you can do, but working out what you're happy for them to do and what you're not. But I've seen that appetite shift massively. When I first started off in SOC, it was like you call someone up and they're like, please don't touch my systems. Please don't do anything about this, even if it's an active threat. They wanted to do it themselves. That appetite has really changed, that people want you to contain stuff. I think third-party providers probably now have more access than ever. Automated response books, playbooks, and other automation also can take action in people's environments. So in this world where maybe we're rightly valuing the speed of containment and the cost is increased access, how do you limit the potential damage of that?
I think the big one, and I think you kind of said this without saying it. You definitely implied it. I think that brand and reputation are huge here. And so we have these companies who have existed now for 10, 15, depending on the service, 20 years. And you haven't seen their names dragged through the mud. You haven't seen negative outcomes from them. And that fact that they've been around for so long, and the fact that they've operated so well, I think that gives you the ability to trust them, to put more faith in them, to say, hey, before I let you look at these few logs, well, now I want you to have access to my systems for investigations. I want you to come in and dig into them. And I think it's the fact that those names have existed for so long and are so recognizable. I don't think, at least I hope, at least for businesses that I do business with, I really hope that they're not finding a company that started 6 months ago and saying, come on in. Oh, you're a new agentic AI SOC. Bring everything you have into my environment. Here's full access to it because you're the next new bright, shiny thing. That would scare me. That I hope nobody I do business with is doing that. But those 15, 20-year-old companies that are well established, I think they have earned the trust that we place in them.
That's so sorry, startups, but but no, I hear you, and I think a lot of those big companies will buy up the innovative startups and then kind of keep them under their wing. It's probably what we see a lot of this consolidation going on in the industry, and maybe that's one of the drivers. Though there are many, so I like. I like the way we've been so far, and I do want to move us off to something. We've talked about kind of a lot of some moral implications and trust, and talking about people. So then my next part will be about what happens when there is not necessarily morality tied to these things. Slight teaser, but before we get into that, I want to give some recommendations, because I know we said, as well as for the vendors, so the software kind of risks that might be introduced, and external security teams, there's maybe some similar ways that you could have faith in them. So beyond just being here for 15, 20 years, is there anything else? I think there is, that you can look for to evaluate them, or how can you be confident that they take their security seriously?
I think it's, there are a lot of things. Difference, these are a personal choice. Some people hate them, some people love them. Certain compliance standards, a company that's willing to go and adhere to, say, SOC 2, for example, maybe a little more trustworthy than somebody who's like, I'm not going to obtain that. I have no interest in that. And some of the other compliance frameworks that are out there for, business trust, if you will, I think is a really good way. But I really think reputation for me, if I were a buyer, reputation would be a huge part of it. Sitting down, being able to know who's involved, know their background, know where they come from is a huge part of the conversation for me.
So let's move ourselves on to this. We've got to haven't got a huge amount of time to cover this, but I think we'd be remiss not to bring into this conversation and this concept, which has been around for ages, to the latest potential battleground for watching of watches, and this is AI agents. And I think that AI agents is kind of nothing hugely new that we've seen in SOC environments or in security environments, because it's basically just automation with a little bit of flourish, if I was to be super critical. And we've been automating for ages. So where do you stand on the use of these AI agents that are meant to revolutionize some of our workflows? And some companies even might advertise that the entirely autonomous SOC is now something that's possible.
I walked around a conference a couple of months ago, and one of the things that I noticed at that conference was that literally every second poster was AI SOC, AI response. It is what everyone is pushing right now. And I can't help but think of a post that Marcus Hutchins made in January, that he said that, wouldn't be surprised if defenders using AI was actually doing more harm to cybersecurity than these supposed AI-powered attacks that we're seeing. And certain things, I think, yes, you can definitely use AI as a coding assistant. You can definitely use AI as a knowledge retrieval agent. I don't, however, think that AI should be taking actions in a SOC on its own. I don't think it's at the point where we can trust it yet. We've seen reports of AI deleting entire file systems, in the past. And I think hallucinations and misinterpretation of prompts are still too much of a real world thing to give too much control to some of the stuff that's out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And to be fair, I have, starting from a very skeptical position, I have seen some actual impressive examples of where SOC has used it. It's mostly in the enrichment and context adding stage, because that's harmless, and it does have a bit of a better ability to be more creative. Look around that.
100%.
But then in the responses, though, I have heard, and I have not been a part of this, but some of my friends are still in SOC. They talk about, most often it comes up, I have to still approve it, but I'm almost always clicking yes. And they are even to a confidence level where they said they'd be happy to kind of let that be fully automated. So these are kind of level 1 analyst actions, and some of them talk about getting to level 2. But the real difference for me is between the monitoring people and monitoring AI agents or just technology in general is computers are stupid, and I think AI is also stupid. So you're monitoring for stupidity more than you're monitoring for malice or intent. And it might believe it's doing the best thing on the instructions it's been given and knock everything absolutely offline. So yeah, for me, enrichment all the way. But I would keep an eye on actions. I do think that maybe caution is the right thing to say to everybody at this point. But I'm interested to see that maybe we might get to a point where some of these actions are expected to be automated in containment, even without that human in the loop at some point. But watch this space. So this was a huge topic, and we definitely could have talked a lot longer on many of the three sections. So if you did enjoy this, if you want to discuss with us the art of what it takes to watch the Watchers when it comes to cybersecurity, you can find us, comment on wherever you're watching this now. We want to hear from you. If there's anything else you want us to discuss about, you join the conversation and maybe we can dive deeper into one of the areas that we covered today. But Tyler, thank you very much. And as usual, I'd like to ask you any kind of closing thoughts for how we could leave the audience with some thought-provoking wisdom that they can apply in watching Watchers.
I think I'm going to go with 3 words: trust but verify.
Thank you, everybody.